All right, well, thank you for coming. My name is Bil Corry, and today we're going to be talking about asynchronous threads. How many of you have ever used asynchronous threads before? Yeah, not many. Usually what happens is you try and use it, and it doesn't work, and you don't know why, and you have no way to figure out how to debug it. So today what we're going to do, we're going to talk about what they are, how to use them, how to debug them, some of the problems you might encounter when you try and use them. So asynchronous threads, it's just simply some code that runs in parallel to the page that's currently running. It's the reason you use it is for three reasons. The main one, the one that I normally use it for, is to offload tasks. Things, little snippets of code that take a long time to do, but you don't necessarily want the user to wait around for it. In particular, one of the projects I was on, it had this wizard you go through. You went through about 7 or 8 pages. And then at the end of it, the user would review everything, say, yeah, that's what I want, and then go off and create all these records and all these tables, and it would just take 2 minutes. And it just didn't make sense to have the user sit around while I was waiting. So instead what it would do is it fire off an asynchronous thread that took care of all of that. And instead, the user just got an immediate feedback page that says, thank you for submitting your information. And so to them, it seemed like a real snappy application, while in the background, Lasso was chugging away creating records. Another reason you want to use it is for recurring events. Lasso actually internally uses it for the email queue and the Lasso event. You know, if you set up a Lasso schedule event, it uses these internal threads to do it, these threads. And the other reason might be, the third reason might be if you have some network services. I've actually used it with one of my custom tags that restarts the site. The site has to run in the context of site 0, but since you can't reach site 0 through the web browser, I instead created an asynchronous thread that listens on a particular TCP port, and it uses that then to send commands to know which site to restart. The best way to understand asynchronous threads is to first understand how a normal web request comes in. And since this is the advanced track, I'm sure you probably everybody here knows, but just in case you don't. The browser sends a request to the web server, say Apache. Apache then determines the request is for Lasso. So it sends it to the Lasso connector. The Lasso connector then sends it on to actual Lasso server. Lasso server processes the request, sends it back to the Lasso connector back to the web server back to the end user. So that's normally how it happens. With synchronous threads, what happens is that same process happens, but when it gets to the Lasso server, that page then can branch off and create one or more asynchronous threads. And that asynchronous thread is going to run the same way as a normal Lasso page with some exceptions. So it will, just like a normal page, it will run until either it terminates normally, so you don't have to end it in any particular way. It'll also, if it crashes or if it's taking too long or Lasso site's restarted, it'll come to an end. And there are some synchronous threads that can be made to run forever, for as long as Lasso's running. And we'll get to talk about that in a minute. Some caveats with asynchronous threads. Because it doesn't originate from the web, it doesn't have access to any of the web request type things, like the client headers and the action parameters. You won't see any of that inside of an asynchronous thread. So if you want to see those, you actually have to copy them in. We'll get to that in a minute. Also, all the paths are all messed up for the files. You have to go from the hard disk root. You don't have relative paths from web root. Since it's not a web request, there's no web root. So everything has to come from a hard disk path. What that means for your asynchronous thread then is that you can't use include because it's limited to web root paths. So you have to use file read and process to make the same thing happen. And of course, all the variables that are on your main page are not accessible inside your asynchronous thread. So, and probably the biggest drawback, of course, is that the synchronous thread happens in a way that you can't actually see it. So the only way you can have access to it is by some sort of third-party source, like you send it off to a database, or you send it to a file, or you send it to yourself via email. That's the only way you can get some feedback out of it, feedback from back out of it. And it has a priority of its own, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So just to kind of give you an example of how you create asynchronous threads, as you can see, this is a very simple example. The curly braces tell you that this is some code I want to run asynchronously, and inside of it is I have just output the string hello world. Now, since you can't get the output from an asynchronous thread, this particular example doesn't really do much, but it does run asynchronous. By the way, if you have any questions, just feel free to jump in. We're not going to wait till the end. So the big question is, of course, how do I get my data into asynchronous threads since you don't have access to the page variables? And there's a couple of ways. One is you can use globals. They're available to all the threads running on the site. They have their own issue with thread locking and whatnot, so I don't use that method, but but just directly into the synchronous thread, you can pass in parameters. And so what I've done here is just to show you an example. And don't say too hard because I have a better way for you. Just to show you. So you have an array. This is passing in the value P1 and P2, right? There's two parameters, and they have the values 1 and 2. So to give you an idea, within this asynchronous thread, if I wanted the value 1, this is what I'd have to do. I'd have to use the parameters that it has access to, find the P1, get it, because when you do a find on, this is advanced, so I don't have to say it, and then you get the value. So that's how you do get the P1, and then you'd have to do the same for P2. It's kind of a hassle.